The first time he noticed the Mare missing, he thought it was just another quiet morning. The sun had barely risen, the sky still holding on to the last bit of night, and the barn sat still except for the soft rustling of hay. But when he stepped into the pasture, the gate was pushed open just a little, and her tracks were fresh in the dirt. A trail stretched out toward the long road that cut across open land. He followed the hoofprints with a puzzled frown, wondering why a pregnant Mare would wander so far when she usually stayed close to the barn. He expected to find her just beyond the trees or near the creek where the grass grew thick. Instead, he found nothing. The tracks went on until the road turned and vanished into the distance. He returned home shaking his head, thinking she would come back on her own. It had happened before with horses, especially ones carrying weight and looking for comfort. But when she walked back hours later, tired and dragging her feet, something about the way she moved felt wrong. She didn't walk like a Mare enjoying open fields. She walked like she was searching for something she could not find. He brushed her coat gently, noticing how she leaned against him as if she wanted to say something she could not voice. The next morning, she slipped away again. This time he caught sight of her from the barn window. Her stride was slow but steady, her head low, her belly heavy with the unborn foal. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was following a path with purpose. He watched her cross the open pasture and squeeze through the same loose gate. Before he could grab his jacket or boots, she was already halfway across the field, her silhouette growing smaller with every step. He saddled up and followed her from a distance, not wanting to scare her or change her direction. She didn't look back once. She didn't hesitate. She kept walking like she was being guided by something only she could sense. The land stretched wide and quiet, the morning wind brushing past the dried grass. He kept his horse slow, watching her carefully. She traveled nearly 2 miles before she finally stopped in front of an old abandoned shed at the edge of the neighboring property. The shed had been empty for years. Its roof sagged, walls leaning, and boards worn thin from time. No one stepped near it unless they had a reason. The Mare stood still before it, breathing hard, her sides trembling. He waited, expecting her to come back toward him, but she stayed by the shed door, nudging it with her muzzle like she wanted someone inside to open it. But there was nothing, no movement, no voice. Just silence and the low creaking of loose boards in the wind. He finally approached her slowly and reached for her halter. She resisted just slightly, as if she wanted to stay. When he tugged gently, she lowered her head and let him lead her home, but she kept looking back over her shoulder. Over and over again, as if leaving the shed was painful for her, as if something she cared about deeply had been taken from her. Back at the farm, he gave her fresh hay and water, but she picked at it with little interest. She paced inside the stall, turning her head toward the direction of the shed every few minutes. He tried to calm her with soft words and slow strokes along her neck, but nothing eased her restless energy. She wasn't a wild Mare, she wasn't the type to wander or disobey. She had always been gentle, steady, and trusting. That was why her behavior now pulled at him in a way he couldn't ignore. The next morning she was gone again before the sun was up. This time she moved faster, as if the urgency in her heart grew stronger overnight. He didn't wait. He followed her closely, watching the determination in her steps. She didn't pause to graze or sniff the ground. She walked like someone being pulled toward something she could not give up. When she reached the shed again, she stopped in the exact same place. She touched the same worn board. She stared through the cracks like she expected to see someone waiting for her. He dismounted and walked around the shed. He noticed faint hoofprints near the back, smaller prints pressed into the dirt. They weren't from her. They were from something else. Something lighter, something that had been there recently. His breath caught a little as he crouched down to study them. They looked like the tracks of a young horse. A foal, a very small one. But that didn't make sense. There were no foals on this land except the one she carried. He leaned closer, tracing the edges of the prints with his finger, noticing how fresh they looked. Fresh enough to make him question what the Mare knew that he didn't. She pushed her nose against his shoulder, restless again. He looked into her eyes and saw something like grief. A deep sorrow no animal should carry alone. He returned home with her once more, but his mind stayed by that old shed. He kept thinking about the prints, the Mare's behavior, and the strange way she stood there like she was waiting for someone she lost. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The wind rattled the shutters, and he kept imagining the Mare pacing, feeling drawn toward something she couldn't reach. He checked on her several times in the stall. Each time she lifted her head slowly and looked toward the north field where the shed sat hidden behind tall grass and shadows. By morning, he decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. Something about the shed held meaning for the Mare, and he needed to understand why. When he stepped outside, the air felt heavy, like a quiet warning. The Mare stood near the gate again, her ears pointing toward the same direction. She didn't try to run this time. She just waited for him, breathing with slow, shaky breaths. He placed a rope gently over her neck and led her down the familiar path. She followed without hesitation, her steps tired but determined. When they reached the shed, she pulled slightly ahead of him, stopping again by the same broken board. She pawed at the dirt, her body trembling from something deeper than exhaustion. He touched the door and pushed it open. Inside, the light barely reached through the gaps, but he could make out scattered straw, worn blankets, and old pieces of rope lying tangled in the corner. It looked like someone had been there before, someone who needed shelter, someone desperate. The walls carried faint scuff marks, the kind left by hooves. Smaller hooves? He stepped farther inside, but the Mare stayed by the doorway. She let out a low sound, soft and aching. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something heavier. He turned toward her and suddenly understood something was deeply wrong. The story he thought he knew about her life before she came to his farm might not have been the full truth. There were pieces missing. Painful ones. He looked down and noticed something he hadn't seen from the outside. A dried stain beneath the straw. A small piece of broken leather near it. He lifted it carefully and felt a chill go through him. It belonged to a halter, a small one. He swallowed hard as the Mare lowered her head toward the ground beside him, her body shaking with a sadness she couldn't hide. He didn't know exactly what happened here, but he knew she hadn't been wandering without reason. She had been returning to a place tied to something she lost, someone she couldn't let go of. And before he could process what that meant, he heard a sound behind the shed, a faint, shaky breath, a soft rustle in the brush. He rose slowly, heart pounding, unsure whether to move toward it or to stay still. Whatever was hiding there was the reason the Mare had walked 2 miles every morning. And he knew that when he stepped around the shed, his life would change, because the truth she had been carrying would finally come into view. He stood still for a long moment, trying to steady his breath as the noise behind the shed rustled again. The Mare pressed closer to him, not with fear, but with a kind of pleading. Her body trembled lightly, and her ears stayed fixed on the far corner of the brush, as if she already knew what waited there. He slowly stepped around the weathered boards, brushing aside the tall grass as he moved. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the strange mix of dread and hope building in his chest. He had followed many trails in his life, but none had ever felt like this one. None had ever carried this much quiet sorrow. When he reached the back of the shed, the ground dipped slightly into a shadowed hollow where the grass grew tall and tangled. At first he saw nothing but weeds and broken branches scattered by wind. Then he heard it again, a faint little sound, soft enough that it would have disappeared if he hadn't been listening so closely. It was a breath, a small one, too small to belong to anything grown. He crouched down, pushing aside the brush, and finally saw a pair of eyes staring up at him. They were wide and frightened, reflecting the slanted morning light. The little body was curled tight against the ground, ribs showing beneath rough patches of fur. The foal didn't move, didn't try to stand. It only watched him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, its breaths shallow and uneven. He felt his heart sink as he realized this was no wild young horse. This foal had been hiding here for a while, long enough for the grass to grow around its shape and the dirt to pack beneath its body. He didn't reach out right away. He knew better than to push a scared animal too quickly. He kept his voice low, steady, and soft, letting the foal feel his presence without forcing anything. The Mare stepped forward until she could see the foal too, and the sound she made was unlike anything he had heard from her before. It was not loud, but it carried a deep ache, a longing that filled the space between them. The foal's head lifted slightly at the sound, and its ears flicked toward her. That small response made him realize something he had suspected but hadn't allowed himself to accept. They knew each other. Maybe they were separated before he bought the Mare. Maybe they had been taken from one another earlier, long enough for both to suffer alone. Maybe the Mare had been searching for her young all this time, drawn back to this shed by memories that clung to her heavier than her own weight. Whatever the story was, it wasn't one he could piece together yet. He only knew that the foal lying in the dirt was the reason she kept walking 2 miles every morning. He slowly stepped back, giving the Mare room. She lowered her head and touched her nose to the foal's neck in the gentlest motion he had ever seen. The foal shivered and let out a soft sound as if trying to respond but too tired to rise. The Mare nudged it again, trying to encourage it, trying to remind it of something familiar, but the foal didn't stand. It barely moved at all. He exhaled hard and knew he couldn't leave them here. Whatever had happened to them before, whatever condition the foal was in now, they needed help. He moved to the side and studied the little animal more closely. The foal's legs looked scraped, patches of fur missing, and he could see bruises that hadn't fully healed. Something must have happened long before he came into the picture, something painful. Something the Mare had carried alone until the moment she found her way back here. He wasn't sure how he would do it, but he wasn't about to walk away. He went back to his horse and unrolled a blanket from the saddle. Moving carefully, he spread it over the foal, keeping his voice steady as he worked. The foal didn't resist. It didn't even lift its head again. The Mare stayed close, hovering protectively with every breath. He looked at her and nodded as if promising her without words that he would try his best. He had never been the type to run from responsibility, and this moment felt too important to ignore. He lifted the foal as gently as he could, surprised by how light it felt. Much lighter than a young horse should be. Too light. The Mare followed close as he carried the foal to his horse. He secured the little body with the blanket wrapped around it, careful not to tighten anything too much. He mounted up, holding the foal steady, and started the slow ride home. The Mare walked at his side the entire way, never falling behind, never stepping away from the child she had searched for day after day. Once they reached the barn, he laid the foal on fresh hay and covered it again with another blanket. He checked for injuries more closely this time, wiping away dirt and brushing aside matted hair. There was no wound he could fix on the spot, but the foal's weakness told enough. It needed rest, warmth, and care. The Mare didn't leave the stall doorway, her eyes glued to her foal as if she feared it would disappear if she blinked. Over the next hours he kept checking on them, offering the foal small sips of water and giving the Mare her feed to keep her strength up. The barn felt different with them both inside. The air carried a quiet tension, like the land itself held its breath waiting for something. He tried to understand how such a situation had come to be, who had owned them before. Why was the foal left behind at an old abandoned shed? Why had the Mare been driven to find her way back there every morning? There were too many pieces missing, and each one raised more questions than answers. By evening, he sat outside the stall and rested his back against a wooden post. He watched the Mare nuzzle the foal, watched the little chest rise and fall slowly. The barn light cast long shadows across the dirt floor. Everything felt peaceful on the surface, but he couldn't shake the unease settling deeper inside him. The foal's condition wasn't simply the result of being lost. Something had been done to it. And whoever had done it might still be nearby. That shed didn't belong to him. It belonged to someone else. Someone he had never trusted fully. He pushed the thought aside for the moment, focusing again on the animals. As night settled, he checked on them one more time. The foal's breathing seemed steadier. Not strong yet, but no longer fading. The Mare finally lowered her head to rest, though her ears stayed alert. She was tired, but she wasn't letting her guard down, not even now. He stepped outside the barn and closed the door gently. The night carried a chill, and the air felt heavy. He looked toward the distant shed in the darkness. It stood hidden among shadows, still and silent, but holding secrets he could no longer ignore. He knew he had to go back there. He had to understand what the Mare had been returning to. He had to find out what had happened before she came into his life, what had hurt her so deeply that she walked miles while carrying a child inside her. He had to uncover the truth before someone tried to erase it. And in the darkness, as he stood alone with only the wind for company, he sensed that bringing the foal home was only the start of something much bigger, something tangled, something heavy, something that wasn't done with them yet. He woke up before sunrise the next morning, long before the first rooster made a sound. Something about the silence outside felt wrong, like the calm that settles before a storm. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the cool air, letting his eyes drift toward the pasture where the Mare usually stayed. From where he stood, the field looked empty. He felt a cold pinch in his chest. He didn't want to believe she had slipped away again. He lit the small lantern hanging by the door and began walking, listening to the soft crunch of dry grass under his feet. The ground still held the night's chill. As he neared the fence line, he saw the faint outline of hoofprints leading away from the pasture. They were fresh. She had wandered off again, and whatever drove her to leave home was only getting stronger. He ran a hand across his jaw, feeling the tension press deeper into his bones. He kept asking himself why she kept walking those same 2 miles, always toward the same direction, always slow and quiet, as if she were afraid of being seen. He followed the prints until the sun started lifting itself over the horizon, painting the sky in soft gold. When he finally spotted her in the distance, she was standing near the old creek bend, the same place he had found her before. She wasn't grazing or resting. She stood facing the same spot in the woods, her ears pointed forward, her body stiff. It was like she was waiting for something or someone, and every instinct she had told her not to leave that place. He whispered to her from a few yards away, trying not to spook her. She didn't run. She just turned her head slowly, her eyes dull and tired as if she hadn't slept in days. He noticed her sides trembling again, the same way he'd seen the night before. It scared him. A pregnant Mare shouldn't look that drained. She should have been moving with more ease, not forcing herself to walk miles in the dark. Something was hurting her, something deeper than anything he could see on the surface. He gently led her back home, walking at a slow, steady pace so she wouldn't strain herself more. She stayed close to him, but every few steps she would lift her head and look back toward the woods, like a part of her was being pulled away. He tried not to think about the uncomfortable feeling brewing inside him. Whatever drew her there wasn't fading. It was getting stronger each night. Back at the barn, he checked her again, running his hands along her belly and legs. The foal inside her pushed lightly, a small movement under her skin that reassured him she wasn't losing strength completely. Still, something felt wrong. She flinched when he touched one side of her belly, not sharply, but enough to show that something deeper hurt her. He had raised enough horses to know when an animal was hiding its pain. She wasn't just tired. She was struggling. He spent the next hour cleaning her stall, giving her fresh water and feed, and keeping her under the soft glow of the barn lantern. Even inside, with the doors closed, she kept turning her head toward the open fields, listening for sounds he couldn't hear. He wondered if it was instinct, fear, or memory. He had no explanation, but the worry in his chest kept growing. Later that afternoon, he took the long road that stretched behind his property. He wanted to understand why she kept going back to that same place, what she sensed there, what he was missing. The 2-mile walk felt longer than usual, heavy with uncertainty. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, and the wind carried a strange quietness that didn't settle well. When he reached the creek bend, he stopped. The ground was disturbed, marked by deep hoofprints and smaller uneven indentations he hadn't noticed before. He crouched down, studying the soil with narrowed eyes. The smaller marks weren't from his Mare. They belonged to another horse or more than one. He exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of it. His Mare wasn't wandering toward nothing. She was drawn to something familiar. Maybe another horse, maybe a memory. But he had never seen another horse this close to his land. The nearest ranch was far away, and no one rode through this area without telling him first. He followed the tracks deeper into the trees until the canopy grew thick enough to dim the afternoon sun. The quiet felt heavier here, like the woods were holding their breath. He could feel a faint tremor of uneasiness creep up his spine. After a few more steps, he found a patch of flattened grass, then bits of broken brush. Something had been here, something large, and recently, even the air felt different, like whatever had moved through this place carried tension with it. He knelt again and brushed his fingers against the tracks. They were deeper than his mares, spaced wider apart. Whatever horse had made them wasn't calm. It had moved with fear or pain. Or both. He looked around, trying to imagine what would have happened here. What would have made his pregnant Mare walk so far in her weakened state? As he stepped back toward home, his thoughts churned faster than his feet. He imagined possibilities he didn't want to believe. He thought about the stories he'd heard from travelers passing through. Stories about animals wandering for miles trying to return to lost companions. Stories about injured horses disappearing into the woods to hide their pain. Stories about mares sensing danger long before humans ever noticed anything wrong. That evening the Mare refused to eat. She stood in her stall, restless and quiet, shifting her weight from one leg to the other. Her breathing quickened at times, then calmed, then rose again. He stayed with her for hours, brushing her mane and whispering to her soft enough to keep her steady. She wasn't just wandering. She was searching for something she couldn't reach. By nightfall, he heard the distant howl of a coyote. He knew there were predators in the area, but they never came near his property. Still, the sound unsettled him more than usual. The Mare lifted her head sharply, ears stiff, eyes focused on the open gap under the barn door. He could feel her fear vibrate through the floorboards. Something out there wasn't right. Around midnight, she began pacing again. Her hooves tapped the wooden floor in a slow rhythm, each step trembling slightly. He opened the barn door and stood in the cool air. The sky was dark but clear, with a few faint stars glowing above. The fields stretched out quietly, yet something felt off. The night didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. He checked her once more before stepping away, hoping she would rest. But moments after he left, he heard the soft creak of the barn door. He turned just in time to see her slipping out again, moving with surprising determination despite her condition. She wasn't wandering. She was running out of time. He rushed after her, calling her name, his heart pounding against his ribs. She didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She headed straight toward the fields, toward the woods, toward that same path she had walked so many times before. He grabbed the lantern and followed her, the fear in him rising faster than his breath. By the time he reached the halfway mark, she had already disappeared into the shadows ahead. The lantern light shook in his trembling hand. He kept moving. He didn't know what he would find. He only knew that whatever waited at the end of that 2-mile trail was the reason she was suffering, the reason she kept slipping away, the reason she couldn't rest. And when he finally stepped into the first line of trees, he heard a sound he hadn't heard before. A soft, broken cry that didn't belong to the Mare but came from somewhere deeper in the woods. A cry filled with pain and fear. He froze, the lantern light barely touching the ground ahead. He had no idea what waited in the darkness, but he knew this sound would change everything. He took one more step, and the night swallowed him completely. He moved deeper into the trees with slow steps, careful not to make a sound louder than the whisper of leaves beneath his boots. The lantern light shook in his hand as he tried to steady his breathing. That soft cry he had heard moments ago lingered in the dark like something waiting for him to react. Every instinct told him to turn back, yet something stronger pulled him forward. The Mare had run here for a reason, and whatever she sensed had been calling her night after night. The air inside the woods felt heavy, thick with cold that didn't match the mild night outside. He stopped and listened again. The woods were silent now. No wind, no owls, not even the distant rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. It was a silence that pressed on the ears, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. He scanned the narrow path ahead, barely visible under the trembling lantern glow. The ground dipped slightly, and as he stepped down he noticed the fresh disturbance in the dirt, deep hoof prints. 2 sets. One belonged to his pregnant Mare. The other belonged to a horse he had not yet seen. He crouched low, tracing the second set with his fingertips. They were uneven, pressed in strange angles, as if the horse that made them had struggled to stay upright. A horse in pain, a horse desperate for help. His stomach tightened as he imagined what could be lurking ahead. He kept walking until he reached the creek. The faint trickle of water was the only natural sound left. His Mare stood on the other side, her body tense, her breathing fast. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at something lying just beyond the curve of the creek bed. Her ears stayed pointed forward, her tail swaying slightly with agitation. He raised the lantern higher and stepped closer, the cold air growing sharper with each step. When he reached the edge of the creek, he saw it. A shape curled near the bend, small, still, almost hidden beneath the shadow of a fallen log. It wasn't moving. He swallowed hard and kept the lantern steady, edging around the creek until he had a clear view. It was a young horse, thin, weak, covered in dirt and dried mud. The foal looked barely old enough to stand, yet it had managed to walk miles in its condition. Its coat was pale, almost ghostly under the lantern light, and its sides rose in uneven breaths. It lifted its head weakly when he approached, eyes dull with exhaustion. The Mare walked toward it with slow steps, lowering her nose to nuzzle the tiny body. The sound he had heard earlier had come from this little foal, a cry for help that barely reached the edge of the woods. He watched the Mare and the foal for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The Mare wasn't just wandering, she had been searching for this little one. She had sensed it long before he ever heard a sound. But how had this young foal ended up alone, injured, and hidden this deep into the woods? He looked around again, scanning the trees for movement or signs of another horse. Nothing, only shadows stretching long across the ground. He knelt beside the foal, careful not to scare it. The little creature flinched, but didn't try to move away. It didn't have the strength. He touched its side lightly, feeling the thinness of its ribs, the tremble under its skin. It wasn't just hungry, it was dehydrated, weak, barely holding on. The Mare nudged it again, letting out a soft, low sound that held worry and recognition. He felt a wave of dread settle over him. Someone must have abandoned this foal. There was no other explanation. A young horse this small wouldn't survive alone, and no mother would leave her foal willingly. Something had happened. Something painful. Something the little creature couldn't explain but carried in every breath. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small flask of water he always carried. He soaked a corner of his sleeve and brought it gently to the foal's mouth. It lapped weakly, its tongue barely moving. The Mare stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the foal with a tenderness he rarely saw in any animal. She wasn't just drawn to this foal out of instinct. She felt something deeper, a pain she recognized, a bond she couldn't ignore. When he tried to lift the foal, the Mare shifted anxiously, pacing in a tight circle. He spoke to her in a calm voice, running a hand along her neck to keep her settled. "I'm not taking it away," he whispered. "I'm helping," the Mare finally stilled, but her eyes stayed locked on the little body resting in his arms. He lifted the foal carefully, feeling the bones beneath the fragile skin. It was lighter than he expected. Too light. He knew it couldn't walk the 2 miles back on its own. And with the Mare heavily pregnant and exhausted, the return would be difficult. He stepped across the creek slowly, guiding the Mare behind him. Every few feet she nudged his shoulder gently, checking on the foal, making sure it was still breathing. The woods felt even quieter on the way out, as if something unseen watched their struggle. The lantern flickered with each movement, casting long, stretching shadows that twisted with the trees. He tried not to look back. The dark felt thick, and he didn't want to imagine what might be hiding behind it. He focused on the path, on the Mare walking close, on the foal whose breathing grew softer with each passing minute. By the time they reached the open fields, his arms burned from carrying the foal's weight, but he didn't stop. The sky had dimmed to a deep blue, the stars faint and scattered. The air felt colder, carrying the first hints of morning not far away. The Mare stayed right behind him, determined even in her exhausted state. He could see her sides shaking again, the strain of pregnancy pressing against her strength. She needed rest. She needed safety. And the foal needed help he wasn't sure he could give alone. When they reached the barn, he placed the foal onto a pile of clean hay in the corner stall. The Mare stepped inside quickly, lowering her head as if counting the foal's breaths herself. He lit another lantern and hung it above them to keep the space warm. His hands trembled as he checked the foal again. Its eyes were half closed, breathing faint but still steady. He covered it with a blanket and stepped back, letting the Mare settle beside it. She lay down carefully, stretching her neck so she could reach the foal without crushing it. He sank onto a wooden stool, running his hands through his hair and trying to understand how everything had shifted so suddenly. His Mare, already struggling with her own pregnancy, had been drawn here by the cries of a foal that wasn't hers. A foal abandoned or orphaned under unknown circumstances. A foal that needed care he wasn't sure he could provide without help. He stared at the two of them, the Mare and the little foal, resting in the faint glow of the lantern. He couldn't ignore the fear creeping through him. If someone had abandoned the foal, they might still be out there. If the foal had run from danger, that danger could be close. And if the Mare was this connected to the little one, anything that threatened the foal would now threaten her too. Outside the barn, the wind shifted. The old boards creaked softly. Something about the night felt unsettled, like the land itself knew what was coming next. He stood and walked to the barn door, scanning the fields. Nothing moved. Yet he felt a chill crawl up his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had followed them. He returned to the Mare and the foal, keeping watch as the lantern flickered above. The 2-mile trail through the woods no longer felt like a simple path. It felt like a warning, a sign that danger had already reached closer than he realized. And as the Mare lifted her head suddenly, ears sharp, eyes fixed on the open barn door, he felt his heart tighten. She heard something he couldn't yet detect. He stood slowly, hands curling into fists, ready for whatever stepped out of the darkness next. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. He waited in the stillness, listening to the soft breaths of the Mare and the weak rise and fall of the foal's chest. The barn held a heavy quiet, the kind that made even the smallest sound feel louder than it should. The Mare kept her head lifted, eyes locked onto the dark shape of the open doorway. Her muscles tightened again, but this time the fear in her eyes slowly softened into something else. Recognition, relief. A shape began to move at the edge of the lantern glow, and before he could step forward to shield the foal, he saw who it was. An older man walked into the barn with his hands raised halfway in the air to show he meant no harm. His clothes were dusty, his steps uneven, and his face looked worn from worry. He stopped at the threshold, breathing hard. The man could barely speak at first, but the way his eyes fixed on the little foal said more than any words could have. The Mare stood and moved slightly aside as he stepped closer, as if she too understood that he wasn't a threat. The man's voice cracked when he finally found his words. He explained that the foal belonged to a small herd he had tended on a ridge far from here. A storm had scattered them days ago, and the foal had been injured when a fallen branch had struck it. The mother had been unable to help it stand afterward, and by the time the man reached them, the foal had disappeared into the trees. He had been searching every day, following faint tracks until he reached the woods behind the ranch. As he listened, everything that had seemed strange now made sense. The painful cries the Mare had heard, the way she slipped out every night, the strange connection she had formed with the little one. She had sensed the foal's struggle long before he had even known anything was wrong. The foal wasn't abandoned. It was lost. And the Mare, with her own baby on the way, had been pulled to it by instinct and something deeper, something rooted in the old bond horses shared long before humans ever understood it. The man approached the foal slowly. His hands trembled as he knelt beside it, brushing dirt from its forehead. The foal blinked weakly, as if recognizing the touch. The Mare watched with calm eyes, her breath steadying with every moment. He could see that the foal still needed care, but now it had 2 protectors instead of 1. He offered the older man water and a place to sit. The stranger accepted with a grateful nod, lowering himself onto a hay bale near the stall. As he drank, he looked at the Mare with a gentle expression. He said the Mare had more strength than most horses he had ever known. He said she carried a heart that understood suffering in a way only animals who had seen too much ever truly did. He didn't ask for the foal back right away. Instead, he asked what happened here, how the Mare had found her way into the woods, and how the foal had ended up in the barn. When the whole story was told, he let out a slow breath and stared at the lantern glow drifting across the stall floor. He said the foal should stay here a while longer. It needed warmth, steady feeding, and a calm place to gain strength. The Mare had already become its guardian, and separating them too soon might break its spirit. The man promised he would return in a few days to check on both of them and bring supplies to help. When the man finally stood to leave, He gently placed a hand on the Mare's neck and whispered a quiet thank you. She lowered her head as if accepting his gratitude. He slipped out of the barn and disappeared down the dirt road, leaving behind an air of calm that settled like soft dust over everything. The rancher stayed awake the rest of the night. The Mare rested beside the foal, and he sat near them, thinking about how close he had come to missing all of this. If he hadn't followed her, if he had forced her to stay inside, that little foal would have never been found. He realized that sometimes animals knew things long before people did, and trusting that instinct could change everything. Morning came with soft gold light pouring through the barn slats. Birds returned to their usual songs, and the chill of the night lifted. The foal stirred, lifting its head a little higher than it had the night before. It blinked at the light and then leaned against the Mare, drawing strength from her warmth. The rancher brought warm mash and water, feeding the foal small amounts at a time. It ate slowly, but it ate. And he took that as a sign that things were finally turning. The Mare grew calmer. Her breathing normalized and her steps regained some steadiness. She still watched over the foal constantly, but now there was no panic in her eyes. Just a steady, protective warmth. When he brushed her coat, she leaned into his touch instead of shying away like before. He could tell she trusted him now in a way she hadn't at the beginning of this journey. Over the next several days, the barn changed from a place of fear into a healing space. The foal grew stronger with each sunrise, its legs steadier, its movements more sure. It stayed close to the Mare, following her with tiny steps whenever she walked around the stall. Their bond grew deeper, something gentle and steady. He often sat outside their stall just watching them and feeling something warm settle inside him. It felt like hope. The older man returned after a few days, carrying new feed, ointments, and blankets. He checked the foal, smiled at its progress, and thanked the rancher for giving it a chance. They talked for a long time about horses, land, storms, family, and the strange way life sometimes brought the right souls together when they were needed most. The man said he would like to leave the foal with him permanently if he was willing. The rancher didn't hesitate to agree. The Mare had already chosen the little one, and he wasn't going to break what they had built. More peaceful days followed. The Mare's pregnancy reached its final stretch, and the rancher kept a close eye on her. One calm evening, under a sky full of bright stars, she gave birth to a strong and healthy colt. The foal she had found in the woods stood nearby, watching curiously as the tiny newborn took its first shaky breaths. In a quiet, almost magical way, the barn felt complete. 2 young lives had been saved, and each of them belonged right where they were. As the weeks passed, both foals grew into lively, curious youngsters. They'd played together in the pasture, racing with fast strides that kicked up dust trails behind them. The Mare watched them proudly, her ears twitching back and forth as they ran in wide circles. The rancher leaned on the fence and watched too, feeling a rare kind of contentment settle over him. The fear, the tension, the long nights in the woods had all led to this moment of peace. Word spread in the nearby towns about the Mare, who had walked miles to rescue a lost foal. People came by to see her, to admire the 2 young horses running side by side. Some said it was natural instinct. Others said it was something deeper, something close to a miracle. The rancher didn't try to define it. He only knew that the Mare had shown a strength and compassion that changed the course of more than one life. He took pride in caring for them and made sure the story of their bond reached anyone who wanted to hear it. The tale of the pregnant Mare, the lost foal, the silent woods, and the long nights of worry became a gentle reminder to many that hope can appear in unexpected places. It became a story about kindness, instinct, healing, and trust. And it kept the ranch alive with visitors and new friends, which helped more than he first realized. Looking out across the fields, he often thought about how the smallest cry for help could change the course of an entire season. How one Mare's determination had saved a life that would have been forgotten. And how the land itself seemed to breathe easier now that the herd was whole again. The sun dipped low one evening, casting long warm beams across the grass. The Mare stood with her 2 foals beside her, all 3 of them outlined in soft gold. The rancher stepped out to join them, running a hand gently over the Mare's neck. She leaned against him with calm gratitude, her eyes soft and steady. In that moment, he felt the story settle into its final place. The mystery was gone. The danger had passed. What remained was a simple truth that carried more weight than anything else. Compassion could mend what fear had broken. Strength could rise again even when hope seemed lost. And sometimes one long walk in the dark could lead to more light than anyone expected. The ranch felt whole again. The Mare had found her purpose. The foals had found their home. And he had found a deeper understanding of loyalty, instinct, and the quiet ways animals teach people to listen. The story ended not with noise or fear, but with peace, and with the gentle sound of two young horses running freely across the open field, beginning a new chapter of their own.